Welcome to Chapter 10, Lesson 1. This is going to be on microscopes and cell theory. We are on a new unit. It is time to end our unit on energy and move on to a new topic. So let's take a look at some of our new goals. Today, we have our short term goal of introducing cell theory and microscopes. Then, once we've got that established, we are going to dive deeper into the modern principles of cell theory. And so, we're going to spend a little bit more time on that medium term goal, explaining the three rules of cell theory and who's responsible for them and how we can apply them. For our long term goal, this is what we're going to be spending kind of like our quarter on is we're going to dig back into our first unit on atoms and molecules, and we're going to discuss how they tie into what we're talking about and how we start off with atoms and then we build all the way to large organisms with all of the steps that you see there in between. Atoms make molecules. Molecules make something called organelles that we're going to study. Organelles work together to make cells. And then cells make tissues, which make organs, which make organ systems, which make organisms. But that's for later. Now, what we are going to be doing is building off of a grade 5 goal. In grade 5, you had the goal of learning that populations of organisms can be categorized into how they acquire energy. You learned about producers and consumers and how they where they fit in the food energy web. We're going to be building off of that and kind of getting into a much smaller scale with cells and how cells provide and those organisms with those energies. Then your seventh grade teacher next year is going to take what we've learned and build off of that. They are going to take that long-term goal, atoms to organisms, and then extend that into what are called populations, communities, ecosystems, biomes, and biospheres. So we wanted to kind of show you where you're coming from and where you're going to be going with this topic. All right. In order to live, grow, reproduce, all the things that organisms need to do in order to survive and keep surviving as a species, they need to do things like obtain oxygen, obtain food, get water, remove waste. And there's actually a list of several different things that you have to do in order to be considered alive. Now, whether you are very, very, very small, even microscopic, or something as big as a blue whale, cells are going to be involved in all of these functions. So we're going to look at how cells behave and worked on a microscopic level and how that translates into what happens on the organisms level. As mentioned, we are going to be spending time with cell theory. There are three rules that you are going to have to know. So for next week's quiz, not this week, but next week's quiz, there are three rules of cell theory. Number one, all living things are composed of cells. There is nothing that we consider alive that is not made of cells. Now, just because you're made of cells doesn't necessarily make you alive, but in order to be alive, you have to be made out of cells. Number two, cells are the basic units of structure and function in living things. So just like molecules are made of atoms, which are made of protons, neutrons, electrons, which are made up of even smaller things, organisms are made up of smaller parts, and those smaller parts are called cells. So cells are the building blocks of large organisms. There is basically nothing smaller than a cell that can make life. And then finally, the third rule of cell theory is that all cells must come from other cells. There are a couple of different ways for that to happen, but there's no way for a cell to be created except for another cell to make it. Now, I always get asked by students where did the first cell come from? That's very difficult for us to know because the cells have been around for literally billions of years, and so we just weren't around to observe how that happened. There are a couple of theories as to how that happened, and we can get into that discussion sometime. But for now, you just need to know that all cells come from other cells. You, as a human being, are made up of somewhere in the neighborhood of 10,000 trillion cells, I think. Anyway, uh, trillions of cells, and every single one of them came from other cells. All right. This week, we are going to be focusing on microscopes. We didn't know about cells until microscopes were invented because cells are microscopic. You can't see them unless they're very, very magnified. There are two major types. The basic kind focuses light through lenses. So it's going to take glass lenses, which is going to magnify light, and that will magnify images, and we will be able to see very small objects. The other kind that we don't get to play with in school are going to use beams of electrons. We, in a non-pandemic year, will be using compound microscopes. So for the next several years in science classes, you are going to be using compound microscopes. There are many parts to a microscope, and that's what we are going to be focusing on this week. But for magnification, the two most important parts are the eyepiece and the objective or nose piece lenses. The objective or nose piece lens, they go by both names. You'll see some resources refer to them as the objective lens, and you will see other resources refer to them as nose piece lenses. The total magnification is going to be calculated by multiplying the eyepiece magnification and the objective or nose piece magnification. So, for example, here we have a compound microscope. We have one set of magnification up here with the ocular lenses. Ocular means eye, so eye lenses or eyepiece or the ocular lens. And then down here are the objective lenses. Now, all of these other parts are what we're going to be focusing on this week. There'll be activities this week to help you learn the parts of the microscope. And that's all this week's quiz is going to be, are just the names of these parts and what they do. Okay, so for magnification, the ocular lens is going to start it off. And in this case, that 10x means it's going to be multiplying light 10 times. So already what you're going to be looking at is going to be 10 times larger. The next set of magnification comes from the objective or nose piece lenses. And for those, you are going to have different options, different levels of magnification. This, what's called a turret, rotates, and so you can switch between different levels of magnification. And so we can choose between a 4, a 10, a 40, or a 100. So for total magnification, we are going to take the ocular lens and multiply it by the objective lens. So we can only have one objective lens at a time. So the lowest magnification on this compound microscope is going to be the ocular lens at 10 and the objective lens at 4. So 10 times 4 is 40. The total magnification at the lowest setting is going to be 40 times magnified. The next setting, as you can see, is a 10. And so when multiplied by the ocular lens, which is also 10, 10 times 10 is 100. The image will be magnified 100 times. And then 10 times 40 is 400. And then finally, 10 times 100 is 1,000 total magnification. All right. When you are looking at an actual microscope here, you can see the magnification is written on there. That 40, this 10 back here, and this 4 right there, those are the magnification levels of the objective lens. And so you would multiply that by whatever your eyepiece is. All right. The kind that we don't get to play with in schools, you have to kind of get to the university level to get to that point, are electron microscopes. These are going to use beams of electrons to kind of map objects. This gives us a very, very high magnification and resolution. Now, these parts we don't have to learn. This week's quiz won't have any of these parts on there, but I wanted to show you that it looks very, very different from how a compound microscope works. But basically, you have what's called an electron gun. and it's going to fire beams of electrons. And then whatever you want down here that's being magnified, these electrons are going to bounce off of. And then these instruments here are going to kind of collect them and create an image on a computer. So this is what an electron microscope looks like. So the electron gun is going to be up here and then go through all of the parts, and you would put in the sample over here. And then your computer is where the image is actually going to be produced. All right. There are some really cool pictures out there taken with electron microscopes. You can just search for electron microscope images, and you can get some stuff like the following pictures. So what I'm going to do is show you a picture and then give you a few seconds to try to guess what it is. Let's begin. So here we have something. This, believe it or not, is a butterfly's tongue. Butterflies' tongues are long and they spiral up, and the tongues have to be long enough to reach down deep into a flower. And so, when the butterfly is not feeding, it has to curl up its tongue like this. But this gives you an idea of how detailed an electron microscope image can be. You can see all the tiny little parts on a butterfly's tongue. So definitely very, very magnified and has a very high resolution. This gross looking thing is something called a hydrothermal worm. This is a worm that lives near hydrothermal vents deep in the ocean. This is the surface of salt crystals. So little grains of salt. This is what they look like when magnified with very high resolution from an electron microscope. As a clue, this makes people sneeze. This is what pollen looks like. So this is an individual pollen cell, and yeah, this is that yellow stuff that's all over the everything outside in the spring and fall, and this is what goes up into your nose and makes you sneeze. This is something that's actually pretty relevant this year. This is a virus. So this is a virus, and the surface that it's landing on is the outside of a cell. So if cells are so small and microscopic, you can see just how small a virus is compared to a cell. But yeah, very relevant these days. All right. So your homework is to read chapter 10, lesson 1, or if you're on the online or newer version of the book, chapter 9, lesson 1. It's pages 332 to 339 in the regular book. Basically, if you're doing the online book or if you've got the new book, it had better be about microscopes and cell theory. If it's not, you're on the wrong page and you need to do some problem solving. This is going to be due next week, and I'll post the correct answers on next week's weekly guide. We are going to take 2 weeks to talk about Chapter 10, Lesson 1. This week's quiz is just on microscope parts. All you have to do is complete the activities and do the practice quiz for the microscope parts. That's it. Later on in the week, when we have more time, you'll do work on chapter 10 lesson 1, which will also talk about cell theory and cell theory scientists. That's what's next week's quiz is going to be on, is the cell theory, the rules, and the cell theory scientists. Both of these weeks are 4-day weeks, so we've kind of a condensed time frame. But yeah, 8 school days to get through this lesson will be plenty of time. All right. So good luck. Go learn those microscope parts.